Hi, everybody. It is being recorded. Okay, I will stay on. Thank you. I got the notice. Welcome to Exploring Anti-Black Racism and Children's Rights. Today, we're having a panel discussion exploring the impact of discrimination on children and youth, as well as good practices for addressing racism. We have three panelists here today to discuss anti-Black racism and its impact on children's rights. Each panelist is going to have about 10 minutes to introduce themselves and talk about what they believe is important when thinking about children's rights. This will follow by an informal Q&A with me, followed by a Q&A with you, the audience. As Kate mentioned, the session is being recorded with consent from our panelists. The Canadian Coalition for the Rights of Children believes that a systems approach is the best way to ensure that all children can realize their rights. This panel discussion is yet one step, certainly not the culmination of how the CCRC needs to engage with anti-Black racism, and we acknowledge that. We need to engage with anti-Black racism in our policy and advocacy work. The CCRC is committed to addressing anti-Black racism, and we chose this issue for the webinar today in AGM, but this is only the beginning. We are committed to not simply discussing these issues, but acting, and we cannot wait to find out how from the three panelists here today. So we have Cheyanne Ratnam, Bissy Wariyo, and Agapi Gessesse. Cheyanne has dedicated much of her time and expertise in child welfare and homelessness. She is the co-founder and executive lead of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, the OCAC. She serves on the board of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto as vice chair and the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Board lead, on the board of Scarborough West Community Legal Clinic, and on the Association of Community Legal Clinics of Ontario's Race Equity Working Group. She is a program facilitator for Next Gen at the Mosaic Institute, and is an independent consultant, capacity builder, public speaker, as you will see, and ambassador of the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada. In 2016, she was the recipient of the prestigious One to Watch Alumni Award, awarded by her alma mater. In 2017, she was recognized by the United Way of Greater Toronto as one of 3 women who inspire International Women's Day. Bissy Wariyo is also here, an educator, strategist, researcher, and wellness advocate based in Toronto. Currently, she's an employment consultant at Youth Employment Services, working on Career Accelerator Program. Bissy also spends her time as a residential care worker with Story Homes, as Director of Policy Programming with the newly launched Canadian Black Policy Network, and as a research manager for The Village, a wellness company dedicated to creating initiatives that support the emotional, spiritual, physical, and financial advancement of women of color in Toronto and Montreal. Finally, we have Agapi Gessesse. She is the Executive Director of CEE, Center for Young Black Professionals, an organization dedicated to addressing economic issues affecting Black youth. She is passionate about CEE's mission-driven and evidence-based work. Agapi also served as Executive Director of POV 3rd Street, an organization that helps marginalized youth break into the media industry through training, mentorship, job placement, and professional development opportunities. So without further ado, please give a warm virtual welcome to our first panelist, Cheyanne Ratnam.
Thank you so much, Tara, and I'm very grateful to be able to occupy space here today, especially with a panelist of BIPOC people. Like, how often do we see melanin just, bless the screen like this? I mean, melanin is beautiful, and I'm really glad to be here with my colleagues today. And as Tara had said, I do have a background in child welfare, but also in the youth homelessness sector and the immigration settlement sector as well. So currently, I am the co-founder and the executive lead of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition. I also was appointed vice chair of the Children's Aid Society of Toronto's board of directors, and also appointed as the board lead for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And as Tara had said, everything else. And I think for me, what I wanted to do is really ground this panel in terms of a statistic. So, and I'm situated from Scarborough, Ontario. So my perspective is going to be predominantly on Toronto and GTA specific demographics, okay? And so when we look at the GTA, but specifically Toronto, and I'm pretty sure that this stat is actually reflective beyond the GTA as well. So within the general population, and we look at demographic breakdown, only 8% of our population is Black, young people and Black families. However, within the child protection system or child welfare system, about 50% is disproportionately represented by Black families and young people. So let's look at those two numbers. There's 8% in the population, and yet, although it's 8%, over 40%, almost 50% are overrepresented disproportionately within the child welfare system. And so for me, I wanted to really look at this from a systemic lens. Now, what is going on here? Because as we know, there's child abuse everywhere. There's neglect everywhere. Okay, this is not a Black issue. This is not an Indigenous issue. This transcends ethnicities, backgrounds, geographic locations. But when we look at the systemic consequences of how Western society is run and operationalized, we know that disproportionately, areas where there are higher percentages of Black and brown bodies are over-surveilled. So what do I mean by saying over-surveilled? There is a higher percentage of policing and also authoritarian institutions where our children are being watched and alternate caregivers are being represented, like school boards, etc. They also assume stigma, stereotypes, and other biases that also disproportionately end up becoming calls to Children's Societies of Toronto saying, hey, we have a problem with this child or this family. And so because of the over-surveillance, that is a systemic issue. Does this mean that areas where there is a predominantly white neighborhood, upper class or middle class, does that mean that these areas do not have child abuse issues? No. It just means that they don't have as much surveillance, they don't have much policing, and they don't have as much scrutiny. People in areas where there's disproportionate BIPOC communities, we know that there's a lot of scrutiny in terms of the way that we move, the politics of our bodies, and that also translates into who comes into care and who does not. So let's ground that over there. So 8% versus about 50%. So the other thing is poverty is a systemic issue. The child protection system, the child welfare system within the Canadian context, but also worldwide, has had an issue in terms of differentiating between poverty issues, so issues stemming from poverty, and child abuse issues. We have a high percentage of people who have been taken away or apprehended because of poverty issues that could have been addressed through family supports and other means. This is a huge issue within the child welfare system. And I'm pretty proud to sit on the board for CAST because we are doing a lot of work around this. But this is not going to solve itself overnight. It's going to require a lot of work. And so we know that child welfare, when we think about child welfare, anti-Black racism, and child rights, we cannot think of them as silos. The child welfare system cannot be thought of as a silo. The child welfare system has also needs to also be connected to the interconnected sectors, right? So, whether it's child welfare, mental health, education, settlement, all these sectors need to work together in order to sustainably solve issues, in order to meaningfully solve issues. Child welfare is a cross-jurisdictional, cross-sectoral issue. And if we're not doing things connectedly, we're never going to find sustainable changes. And the solutions that we're going to find are just facelifts, superficial, and they're never going to actually cut to the root issues. The other thing is that the ideological framework of child protection is Western. And so not only do people who are Caucasian have that privilege of, aligning with Western ideology, the people who are from the global South, such as myself and people on the screen, we do not have that privilege. And therefore, we're even more scrutinized by the system in terms of our ideology of what child rearing is, what family making is, how we operationalize as a community, and so on and so forth. The other thing is that not only do I have professional experience, I actually grew up in the child welfare system myself. So I did not grow up in foster homes. I grew up in group homes, which is a totally different system. It's there's a lot more scrutiny as well within the system. And so I know firsthand that within these homes, there's an overrepresentation of Black and Indigenous bodies. And that is not okay as well. And that goes back to that systemic issue of how children and families are coming into the system or on the peripherals of the child protection system. The other thing is that I also worked for as a frontline worker, and witnessing homes, but also witnessing some of the clients and families that we work with, I could tell that the overrepresentation is a huge issue as well. Now, when we talk about the UNCRC, the United Nations Convention for Child Rights, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, we know that there are 3 pillars: provision, protection, and participation. Okay, so those 3 pillars are important to remember. However, I would say that the most important pillar out of those 3 pillars is participation, because participation is rarely given priority. And participation is how you meaningfully engage with our communities, how you meaningfully engage with the system and the communities together, and also how you can meaningfully understand with humility how communities differ from one another. Because we know that the Black community is not a monolith, it's not a silo. There's diversity within the Black community. There's sub-communities within the Black community, and there are many religions within the Black community. And so this is something that we often forget, and we look at Black people like Black people, and it makes no sense to me. And I'm sure it makes no sense to my fellow colleagues and the Black folks on this call. And it's not okay, all right? And so although the UNCRC is not a legal binding document, Canada had signed to it in 1990, and then they rectified it in 1991. So that means that we have that obligation and the accountability to also make sure that we're utilizing the UNCRC as the guideline to how we treat children, but also how we uplift and prioritize children to lead their own lives, not just as saviors, because some of us have savior complexes, like we're the workers, so we're going to save them. And it's like, no, that's not where you're going to come from. You're going to come from, you know what? I am the support person in this person's narrative. This person is the leader of their narrative. I'm here to support. What can I do to strengthen them as a human being, but also strengthen their family and their community? And how does this also translate into the child protection system, meaningfully engaging with communities that are Black? And not just one type of Black community, but also the diversity that exists within the Black community itself. And so it's not just about giving more money to child welfare, child protection, it's also about reallocating funds to Black community organizations so they could lead that work too in partnership with child protection systems. And the child protection system itself should not be coming from a child protection lens, because that's a liability lens. It should be coming from a child rights lens. It should be coming from a child first lens. It should be coming from you are the leader of your life and we're here to support you kind of lens. And I know I'm running out of time. So I just wanted to say, at the end of the day, Bissy will actually talk more about that frontline aspect and maybe even some more research aspects. So I'm not going to go too much into it. But I just wanted to showcase that child welfare is not just a local issue. It's not just a child welfare issue. It's a systemic issue that is attached to other systems that include poverty, that include settlement and immigration. We live in a racist country. We're not just in a country that colonized people, it is still colonizing people. And when we think about populations, when we think about Black populations, it's not just Black people, it's also Black people who are mixed with indigenous race ethnicity as well. It's also mixed race Black people as well. It's also African Black people, Caribbean Black people. And so we need to make sure that we are looking at the Black population as a whole in terms of the diversity that exists within it, but also making sure that our interactions with people create these spaces where we're not tokenizing Black people or people who look like me. Oftentimes, so I am Jaffna Tamil, and so for me, I'm oftentimes the one brown person, or most of the time they think I'm Black too, which is okay because I'm African descending. It's all good. But they think that I am that tokenistic person who's going to represent colored people on a panel. I'm also that token person on committees, on boards, etc. And you know what? I have to say though, as an adult, or I guess I'm still a young person, as an adult, I get to say that I'm not tokenized anymore because I have that voice and I do contest a lot of things. A good example is the Children's Day Society of Toronto. I'm the youngest person there, and I am a woman of color, and I'm the vice chair now and the point lead for diversity, equity, inclusion. So even within this organization or this network of the Canadian Coalition for Child Rights, you need to do an internal self-audit on your population membership and see who is missing, who is predominantly represented, who is part of your committees, who is not being asked to speak, who is speaking, who gets to lead, who is sitting back quiet, and why are they quiet? People aren't quiet because they want to be quiet. Maybe they don't have the power or the privilege to speak up, or there are things working against them, right? And people who are part of other organizations, how are you doing a self-audit in terms of anti-Black racism, but also in terms of the organizations and networks that you're from, to make sure that they are meaningfully diversified and not tokenistically present? So I'm going to conclude myself on this and pass it over to Bissy.
Thank you so much, Cheyanne, for that. I appreciate it. Thank you again for Tara for the introductions. I'm really excited to see in the chat we have some people from Carleton University. Hello, Monica Patterson. I had the privilege of going to the Institute of African Studies there, so really excited to see familiar names. So I'm going to be speaking on what I see in the work that I do, again, frontline work mostly, and some of the research that I conduct, but Cheyanne has really touched on a lot of that, so I'll be kind of rushing through that a bit. And I'll try to weave in some possible approaches to anti-Black racism. So I'll kind of first look at the work that I do in the child welfare system as a residential care worker, working in foster homes specifically, and also speak to my experience working at Youth Employment Services on the Career Accelerator project. So in terms of children's rights, in the foster homes I mainly work with youth that are about 14 to 17. So these are going to be youth that are kind of transitioning out of the foster care system, but maybe into semi-independent living, and they're essentially not going to have the supports that they had in a home. So there are a number of things that are abundantly clear to me, which Cheyanne has spoke on, which is the inequitable socioeconomic systems that perpetuate anti-Black racism that leads children to be putting in the welfare system in the first place. So I'm always thinking about what are the steps taken between that first contact with the child welfare system, between the Black child and the Black family, and what are the steps taken to the point where they are then removed from their home. And I also have concerns about the different levels of support that Black children get from their caseworkers once they are in the child welfare system, and how that translates into consistency within foster homes or group homes or wherever it may be. So for example, for me, I can be working in a home with multiple Black youth, but each of those youth will have different caseworkers. So if I'm in a home with 5 different youth and I'm dealing with 5 different caseworkers who are advocating for these youth with different capacities, it can be really challenging to provide that sense of consistency for the youth. And a lot of times the youth can obviously see it as well. And it's also not uncommon for youth to be coming from different agencies. So maybe, for example, a youth is coming in through Toronto CIS, whereas another youth came through Durham CIS, living in the same home now in Toronto, but they're getting different supports and services. So I think maybe an example I can give is that I know here in Toronto, where I am, Wood Green Community Services offers a rites of passage program, which is culturally relevant programming to support Black youth. So I was once working in a home where there were multiple Black youth that were living in the home, but only one of them was going to this rites of passage program, for example. And of course, there are many different factors that go into deciding, whether or not a child or the family wants them to participate in this type of programming. But there does need to be consistency in at least offering that programming and offering that to a Black child, to a Black family for the duration that they're going to be in child welfare system. So that also kind of leads to the support that I get as a care worker when I'm trying to deal with vulnerable youth, and there are another set of challenges that come with that. So for example, every 6 months, I'm supposed to complete a certain number of hours in therapeutic crisis intervention training, which is absolutely essential, but it's not necessarily culturally relevant crisis intervention training or a therapeutic crisis intervention training that addresses racial trauma to work with Black youth, and something that speaks to the trauma that has contributed to issues of mental and physical health, and also the services that Black youth and their families are going to be receiving. as a side note, I've been fortunate enough to have received and continue to receive training to support and interact with Indigenous youth. So I've specifically gone through some training with the Barrie Area Native Advisory Circle. And although simply participating in training is not the only thing I can do to ensure that I'm providing culturally relevant approaches to working Indigenous youth, the fact that those resources and supports are available to me is very important. But in relation to Black youth, I do not have access to that kind of training and support. So there's not really a plan in place to ensure that staff and caregivers are trained in anti-racism with a focus on anti-Black racism. And that, to me, there's a huge disconnect when I see, the ways in which I'm supporting or able to support Indigenous youth versus Black youth. And for someone who isn't going to be Black, who is working with Black youth, this is even more of an issue. So I think that's why I'm really excited to see, at least provincially, we have One Vision, One Voice through its funding through Ontario Ministry of Children, Community and Social Services, with its goal to address these issues, to provide support for Black youth and Black families who are going to have to come into contact with the child welfare system, again, provincially, so it's only real in Ontario. And from what I understand, they're now in phase 3, so they're implementing their race equity practices, and they're going to be helping agencies so they assess that, and hopefully I can see some kind of training and supports as I do to support Indigenous youth. And even to Cheyanne's point, this also makes me think about what it means to be both Black and Indigenous in care as youth. So if a child is Indigenous, they'll likely be in contact with Native Family Services to support them in various ways, and that is great and amazing. But how do we make sure that they're also going to be supported, for example, through initiatives of One Vision, One Voice? But again, that's going to be provincially. So what does that mean for youth that are going to be outside of Ontario? And I think lastly, I'm going to kind of give some stats here, and this is going to be more so on the research side, but also what I've seen as well. I think it's safe to say that COVID has really exacerbated the challenges that youth face while in care and transitioning out of care. But these were challenges they were already facing, and we already know this. And I'm deeply concerned with the well-being of youth, especially who are transitioning out of care or transitioning into maybe semi-independent living. So Children's Aid Foundation, I'm just going to read out some points, put out information that over 93% of former youth that were in the child welfare system applied to the Children's Aid Foundation of Canada's COVID Crisis Fund. So they needed an emergency system for some of the basics, so food and shelter, but a large number of them are also facing mental health challenges, increased isolation, and I say increased because this isn't something that happened as soon as COVID started, and a large number of them were also between 18 and 24, so quite young people. Who are alone. And I think I only have 3 minutes, so I'm going to go on to my next point. But I hope that I've touched on some key points there. Thank you, Tara, for giving me that message. So secondly, I'm just going to try and rush through the other area of work that I focus on, which is around, children's right to education, but ultimately their right to decent work when they are ready to enter the workforce, which in the formal economy can be as early as 15 or 16. So I spoke to this while sitting on another panel earlier this summer, so I'll try to find the recording if I run out of time. But I also work in the nonprofit sector at Youth Employment Services, and specifically focusing on youth between 15 and 29. A large number of these youth are Black. A large number of these youth have already come out of the child welfare system. And it's my job to really support them as they navigate the future of work and the economy and the way that Canada is moving towards more digital focused work, but also in the trades as well. So a couple of points. First off, in what I see, again, a large number of these youth who are facing barriers to employment are Black. At the level of the individual, not a lot of these kids know what skills they will need to be successful in the future of work. I don't know if they are aware of the different industries they can go into, ranging from digital tech to trades. And then there's also accessing relevant technology, devices, stable internet, basic digital literacy skills to then engage in pre-employment training. And some organizations have been very fortunate to be able to provide wraparound supports, but other organizations don't necessarily have the capacity to do so. At the level of the service provider, I just want to make a few points. I have 1 minute left, apparently. When we look at service providers accessing, they're available to Black people, or specifically Black serving, there are not many, and I know Agapi will be able to speak to that. But I also want to talk about the support that us as staff are getting. So, you know, future skills training kind of came overnight, and not a lot of us as staff have actually been properly trained on these skills to then go and train other youth on these skills. So there's that kind of gap in support that we have as staff. And there have been many reports coming out of how Black staff are treated in the nonprofit sector. So there are these layers of anti-Black racism that are being perpetuated that are not allowing, you know, Black youth to thrive, and the Black people who want to serve them to do so as well. And my last point is going to be at the level of government. We have the Government of Canada's Future Skills Objective, which is supposed to be a pan-Canadian approach to ensuring that digital literacy is accessible to all Canadians. But I think there's maybe 2 Black people that are working there. So that kind of just shows the systemic barriers that leave our voices erased in these kinds of policymaking objectives. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Agapi to kind of discuss, I guess, what it means to look at Black leading or Black led organizations.
Thank you so much, Bissy. Thanks for having me. So I think that the other 2 panelists are really well versed in the child welfare system. And the realm that I sit in is what was referred to as 3B. So Black led, Black serving, and Black focused. And I think that's really important in this climate to define and be clear about. So that really means, so Black led means that your leadership and your board is predominantly people of Black people. That your Black serving is that in your mandate you have mandated to serve the Black community specifically and have named it. And then Black focus is really understanding that you're providing culturally relevant programming. And so what we do at C is we train young people in 5 major labor gaps in the Canadian market. Those labor gaps are for Black youth specifically. And we find what those gaps are based off of labor trends. So data and evidence tell us in the next 10 to 15 years, if people don't fill in these roles, that these industries will be in trouble. And the reason why we do that is because much like most pre-pandemic, you know, when other people are employed, it was easier to find employment for our youth, for Black young people. Post-pandemic, now, you know, most of the population is unemployed, and our biggest concern is always, okay, well then our young people are going to be left at the back of this line. And so we're constantly having to navigate and figure out and reassess, you know, what industries that we're working in maybe no longer have that cutting edge or that labor gap that once was there pre-COVID. And I think a lot of the work that we do from 3 very distinct lenses. One is person-centered, which is taking a 360 of a young person's life, looking at their friends, their family, what their food security looks like, their housing security, etc. And we have full-time social workers on staff that help us navigate through that. The second approach is trauma-informed. By virtue of you being Black and in Canada or in North America, period, you're dealing with a level of trauma that is directly correlated with racism, and how that is going to be compounded by life experiences by the time you come to our door. And so what we really focus on is we have full-time psychotherapists that really get to the root of whatever traumas that these young people have experienced that could prohibit them from, you know, changing their minds about where they see themselves going. And then the third approach is culturally relevant. Everything that we do is in the context of being Black and in Canada and entering into the workforce. And that's very important because Black, Indigenous, and people of color are dealing with different levels of trauma and different experiences in this country that have yet to be identified by, I would say, the rest of Canada. And so we create laws and policies and ways to raise children, for instance, that make sense to the white population. And that is just not true for what Canada is shaping up to be. We need to look at, we need to understand what's culturally relevant for these communities, especially if the data is telling us that we are overly disproportionately being represented. You need to take a look at that, and you need to ask questions. You need to ask questions around what does this mean for this population? What does raising children look like for someone in the Caribbean or someone who is of African descent? Blackness is very diverse, and it's not one size fits all. We all come from different cultures, different countries, different continents, different religions, and we really need to examine all of those intricacies so that you can identify whether this, much to what Cheyanne had said earlier, is this poverty? Is this cultural? Or is this actually abuse being taken place? And we really need to take a look at that, because what I might think is outrageous, in a Caucasian person's household might not be to them. And what might seem very strange in my household because of where I come from and my culture might seem very bizarre to them, but very normal to me. And so I think what we need to start thinking about is, how are we translating this, and are we embracing some of these differences as assets, or are we looking at anything that is different outside of mainstream white culture to be demonized or not fit? And I think that's what we really need to start examining. We need to be reaching out to these communities and start to really understand them. I think if we look back on how Indigenous people were, how residential schools were created, that was, you're different and you're not like us, and therefore we must erase this heritage, and you are not fit, so we will now place you in white people's homes that are fit and civilized. And well, look at where we are now. We see where that got us. And so we really need to look at what that might be modern day, and look at the amount of folks who are in the system who are people of color. So I think encouraging also the ability for, at a young age, for there to be a sense of identity. I think also we often see the aftermath of what takes place at an adolescent age, and people need to be exposed to what possibilities are. If you do not know what your options are and what the possibilities are, you're going to grow up in a bubble thinking that you can go as far as whomever around you says you can. And we need to start to fund 3B organizations that are led by BIPOC communities. We have solutions to our communities. I do not need anyone, often I have corporate Canada coming in saying, oh, well, we want to run this program. They already know what it's going to look like, and they just want me to come along. That is not proven to be a solution to my community. So I don't need anyone coming and telling, we don't need anyone coming in and telling us, this is how it should be done. And I have this great idea and the savior complex. Black communities, Indigenous communities, people of color, we know very well what the issues are, and whether most people who are in this sector are here because they have lived experience. And even if they don't personally have lived experience, they, by proxy of a cousin, a friend, you're in that community, you're going to know what the issues are. So we are very clear on what those solutions are. So what we need are people to listen to us and be able to support us by allyship, whether that be volunteering, donating, etc., wherever we see fit, to be able to address at an adolescent age some of the barriers that we already know and anticipate are going to come as they get older. So I think the responsibility of folks moving forward, if they want to have, a young person can know all the rights they want. A young person can walk down the street and tell a police officer, oh, I'm exercising my rights. And we'll see how quickly they might get beat up for that. So it does not matter if we're empowering people with information about what their rights should be. It's what their rights actually are. It's what is being demonstrated in institutions, in our interactions with people, how people are, so fearful of folks that they're calling the police on them, etc. It's in our actions, it's in our social contract. Until we address those things, people knowing their rights will not mean much. So I think we need to start to learn what our responsibility is as citizens, as institutions, and then slowly but surely, hopefully, we will be the last generation that is promised equity. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Cheyanne. Thank you, Bissy. Thank you, Agapi. So please post your questions in the chat, or take your, I don't know if we have, I think we have everybody on mute. So I was going to say, take your microphone off, but post your questions in the chat. I'll moderate those, but I'll start off, and maybe each of you can give maybe a 1 to 2 minute answer to this question. A few of you touched on COVID and on the pandemic, and how the pandemic has shone a spotlight on a lot of the inequities that we're seeing, but not that they didn't exist before. Of course, there was racism before. There's racism during the pandemic. There's going to be racism after, but that COVID has, in a way, exacerbated a lot of the challenges already faced. And I wondered, what do you think that COVID has really shone a light on in terms of anti-Black racism?
So if it's okay if I could just get that started. So in terms of the Ontario Children's Advancement Coalition, we are actually leading the provincial work on what I coined as an ethical systems reset, because you can't modify things because it doesn't hit at root issues. It's just a facelift. And so we need some systemic changes. And so part of that work is resetting the transitional system. We know that child welfare is the biggest pipeline into other violent systems, such as poverty, bail systems, prison systems, mental health and addiction systems, etc. And so because we know that that's the biggest pipeline, and we also know that the demographic in child welfare is overrepresented by Indigenous and Black young people, we also know that part of that pipeline, the people flowing through that pipeline, is overrepresented by Black people. And so for me, the COVID-19 really exacerbated for this, because, as a person from the child welfare system, I know that for the rest of my life, I will continue to experience points of my life that's very unstable because of my experiences. That's a constant for people from my population, right? And so even though I might be stable right now, there's a lot of trauma and healing that a lot of our populations have to go through. But on top of that, the Black population, they're also descendants of the transatlantic slave trade. They are descendants of colonization within their own continents as well. And so they have added intergenerational trauma that they're already dealing with. We know that when a person exits the child welfare system, scratch that. Not exit, you're pushed out, you're cut off the system. So at 18, when you're cut off, you're 18, you're cut off, you don't have that same supports anymore. You are there alone with your thoughts. You are there alone with your body. You are there alone in wherever you're living with your thoughts, body, and whatever else is going to be bothering you. I remember when I turned 18, that was the first time that I sat alone with my thoughts that I put away for all those years that I was in care, because care kept me busy. But now I'm alone. And so that is the first time that mental health really, really gets blown up for young people, because we don't have the supports right there helping us. We don't have that number, or maybe we're not even connected to support systems that are not child welfare. Every young person, right, regardless of what their race is, needs to have at least one person not from the child welfare system who's their person. Right? And we are missing that. But in terms of COVID-19, I'm seeing a lot of increase in terms of mental health discrepancies. I'm seeing a lot of increase in terms of homelessness. I'm seeing a lot of increase in terms of money. So I'm actually one of the first people to actually contact the foundation and be like, hey, I need help. Like COVID, I don't know what's going on anymore, and we need to do something. And thankfully, the foundation was already thinking about it. And when they received messages from me, they're like, okay, we're on it, like, don't worry about it. And then they created that, the pot of money that over 90%, as Bissy was saying, 90% of our young people has accessed. And so financial hardship is also something that's huge. And we know that social determinants of health would mean that if you're not financially well, if you don't have the social connections, if you don't have housing, etc., your health is going to be diminishing. So just by virtue, we know that our young people are not doing well, especially our Black and Indigenous young people.
Thank you for that, Cheyanne. I think I really appreciate everything you said. Honestly, my answer to your question, Tara, is what COVID has shown me, especially like in relation to Black youth or Black populations, is how there has to be sensational moments or extremely trying events that impact, that are so in your face in order for people to care. So as everyone has already mentioned, these were challenges that youth were already facing that have just been exacerbated by care. What we've witnessed with George Floyd and everything happening this year, these are things that are already happening. So I think what this has shown is just another example of, Black people's problems being sensationalized for a short period of time and then dying down and falling off. And so for me, whenever there's these moments, I panic and I try to get everything done that I can, or I try to speak to everyone that I can. I try to, push agendas that I can, because I know that's the moment that people are going to be willing to listen, as opposed to a few months down the line. So I'm glad to see that now, even closing to the end of the year, we're still able to have these really great conversations, because I want to continue seeing this go on and not just wait for another sensational moment.
Thank you, Bissy. Agape, do you want to add to that, or do you want me to move on to the next question from the chat?
All I really have to add, I think they kind of spoke to everything. I think the only thing that I think COVID has allowed us to do is everyone's at home and has nothing to do other than work from home. I mean, if you are, but we're all just paying a lot more attention. So I don't know if we don't do something now, I don't know when that would really happen.
Thank you. So we have a couple of questions from the audience. Thank you for the answers to those questions. I am taking notes. The CCRC is listening. And, Bissy, as you say, hopefully this is not some small amount of time that we're all listening, that this is going to be a lifelong thing. Terrence has a question. Appreciated the comment from Bissy about the extra burden put on Black staff serving Black youth. Would love to hear from the panelists how organizations can best acknowledge and address this reality.
So I can kind of just start by answering based on some of the experiences I have. I would say two things. I think one is, if your organization knows that you cannot best serve a Black youth, and that's your focus, don't vilify your staff for then directing those youth to other services elsewhere. So for example, I know that for youth who are maybe looking into tech programming, Black youth looking into tech programming, there's the Black Professionals in Tech Network in Toronto. If I see that my youth are not going to be able to be best served in the organization I'm working with, I'm going to go refer them to that organization. And I know sometimes with placement numbers and targets and things like that, that may not be something that an organization wants to deal with, but it's kind of like, what are you supposed to do? If you don't have the resources and supports in place, then your best bet is to actually refer that person to the services that will be best able to support them. Secondly, and I was hoping to get to this quite well in the 10 minutes that I was supposed to be allotted, I really think it's about creating opportunities that, one, are going to support Black staff, but also listening to Black staff when they know that there's the best way to approach the Black youth that they want to serve. And also having concrete plans that are going to be long-term for the success of children. So for example, in my youth employment agency, we have some examples of programs and program models like This Way Ahead, which is supported by Gap Inc., where there's months-long plan to train youth with pre-employment training, to provide them with wraparound supports, to hire a number of them, and to retain them. And this is really key. So this is a long-term plan to support the development of these youth. But not every program is like that. And not every corporation that's willing to donate money to a nonprofit is also willing to hire some of those youth as well. And I think we need to see more of those kinds of approaches and partnerships between, for example, corporations and nonprofits, where it's a long-term plan versus a throw of money. And especially when we're thinking about making sure that Black youth are being hired, making sure that diversity quotas within organizations are not just tokens, as Cheyanne has said, and actually long-term sustainable plans to hire and retain.
I think also on top of everything that Bissy had just said, what's very important is to make sure that our Black workers are fast-tracked into supervisory positions where there's overrepresentation of Black youth. It doesn't matter how many frontline Black workers there are. If the supervisors, the managers, the senior managers, and the CEOs do not represent the overrepresented bodies that are in the system as well. And so, for example, the Children's Day Toronto, I'm talking a lot about it because I sit on the board. We're doing a lot of work in terms of making sure that we're providing mentorship to Black workers to be able to become supervisors very soon. And that's very important to us because we know that in Toronto, there's an overrepresentation of Black bodies and Black Indigenous bodies as well. The other thing is, you know, on top of what Bissy had said and what I had said earlier about tokenization, we need to make sure that we understand what engagement looks like and what engagement is, how engagement can be meaningful when we are recruiting Black bodies to your tables, because we're not bench warmers. We're actually there with expertise, and we're there to actually meaningfully participate and lead conversations. And so it's also about making sure that you're being reflective, but not only reflective, but reflexive to some of the gaps that you are witnessing and that people are telling you. And also, it's not just about who you accept into places, because it's all about acceptance. Like, does this person fit this table or whatever? It's also about making sure that tables and spaces are not only safe spaces, but brave spaces. It's a difference, right? Brave spaces versus safe spaces. Brave spaces, people like me can talk very candidly about what's wrong without feeling afraid. Safe spaces is never about dialogue. It's just about being told what it is and nodding our heads or shaking our heads. So create those brave spaces. The other thing is, for example, so the cast, we have Journey to Zero. It's a new program that we're piloting. And also we're connected to the OACAS in terms of One Vision, One Voice. And these sorts of fundamental change-focused initiatives are so important, because that is ongoing lessons and opportunities when it comes to how to better develop a system to better support young people who are Black, who are Indigenous, but also how to recruit foster parents and those caregivers who are reflective of our Black peoples and families as well. But then also to make sure that when we are noticing that we are interacting with a lot of Black families, how are we providing family supports? By looking at them through an asset-based lens and not a deficit-based lens. So for me, I think with Terrence's question, by the way, hi Terrence, I think it's all about the micro, meso, and macro. And at the systemic level, we have to go back to addressing poverty issues, because poverty is racist. Okay, poverty, you know, immigration, we live in a racist country. If you know the immigration history of Canada, we know that the gates did not open for all of us at the same time. Okay, so we're living in a racist country, and we're afraid to say that. It's not just the States who kill Black people, we kill Black people too. So it's all about the micro, meso, and macro, and really looking at ourselves in the mirror and really confronting ourselves in terms of the stuff that we have hidden in our brains and in the back of our minds, and really addressing those issues as well.
I would just say to that, when it comes to number one, not all Black people speak for all Black people. Not all Black people have all of the answers that you may be looking for. And I might be a shock to some, but that is the case. There's a saying in our community, not all kinfolk are friend folk. So, you know, so that's number one. Number two, I think I often hear people talk about like mentorship and how there are educated Black people who you can hire. There's not a lack of us. So like this notion that you need to help us come to a place of education, that's not the case. In Canada, we don't have stats around this, but I know in America, Black women are the most educated population in the entire country, but they have the lowest unemployment rate and they have the most disparities in their pay. So there are Black people who you can hire. And those of you, the Black people who are in your organization that do have that skill set, diversity is not a check mark. It's actually an asset. You know, there's studies that say organizations that have diversity in leadership are 19% more profitable than not. You are sitting on 19% more profit, you know? So if you do have Black youth, or if you do have Black employees, in your organization that do have this expertise, pay them as such. It's a skill. And make sure that they are, if they are leading it, that it's clear that they're leading it because of their skill and not because they're the only Black person in the room. And if they are the only Black person in the room, you really ought to address that immediately.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more question. And this one comes from Scotland. I found the point Agapi made so important about the burden of children knowing their rights in a world that doesn't respect them, whether they know them or not. The current rights discourse really doesn't recognize structural oppression and racism on how rights are realized. What more can we do to shift the narrative that is the UNCRC being rights respecting that explicitly addresses racism?
Seeing how it was my comment, I'll just quickly say, I think it's reversed. The work that we do at SEA, a lot of it, yes, is helping young people enter into the workforce. But the onus is not on young people to assimilate themselves into a workforce that is inherently racist. When is the onus on the employer and that organization to create inclusivity? And I think the same rule falls here. I think instead of teaching young people what their rights are and what they ought to have, we need to then start training people who are in these positions on what they're supposed to be doing. It's just like if we look at Indigenous folks and the treaties we have, you don't need to tell Indigenous people they know what they say. They know what they say. What they would like is for us to honor what we said we would do, So I think we need to start looking at, you can tell young people what their rights are all they want, but what really seems to be needed is a retraining of institutions and people who are in them to explain how they should be addressing young people and the diversity that comes with that, et cetera. So I think we really need to flip it on its head. We need to understand what we agreed to versus what the young people should have rights to.
I think also, I think the question from Lucy is very connected to some of the other questions that are there at the bottom in terms of authentic, meaningful participation. And so for me, when we're talking about structural oppression and structural racism, and first of all, there's anti-racism and there's anti-Black racism. Your institutions need to have two different strategies, okay? And also an anti-Indigenous racism strategy as well, all right? They're different. But anyways, so in terms of young people and families, I think that one of the biggest ways to support someone in realizing their self-empowerment, because we don't empower people, that's a savior complex way to say it, okay? We don't empower people, people empower themselves. So when we are working with young people, my thing, the easiest way to break stigma and break stereotypes, etc., is giving autonomy, not giving actually, just telling people that you own your body and you own your life. When a person comes into the child welfare system, other people drive that bus until they age out of the system. And then all of a sudden we're superhumans and we grow capes and we're flying away and we're just successful, and that's not reality. And so for us, I see some people laughing, right? It's true. So for us, it's important to make sure that when a Black young person comes in, you are a queen, you are a king, you are royalty, and you can be anything you want to do. You own your body, you own your thoughts, and I'm here to support you in realizing that and operationalizing that. That empowerment, that self-empowerment, is so important because Black young people, when you go through the education system, it is so easy for educators to make young people feel like they are not supposed to be successful, that they are not smart, that they are not meant to go to university because of the fact that they are Black. Because of the fact that they are Black. And so the biggest change for me is starting from a young age, especially our young people who come into that child welfare system, to let them know, to ensure that they know that they are the leaders and narrative writers and the authors of their life. And we will support you in driving your own bus. When I talk to governments with MCCSS in terms of the ethical systems reset, I talk about the analogy of having a driver's license. Okay, you can get your G1. That's fine. You can get your G2 and you could have like a person guiding you or being in the car with you while you're driving. And then you could even have your full G license, but not many of us are ready to actually hit the road and get on the highway with a full G license as well. So part of that empowerment, that self-empowerment, supporting self-empowerment, and part of that, you know, making sure that we're breaking down stigma and stereotypes is also making sure that we're sustaining supports even past 18, to make sure that young Black men, women, however they identify themselves, because we cannot look at gender as binary, right? Whoever they are, that they are supported until they feel that they can be independent and that they are independent. And even if they are independent, they still have meaningful supports, and at least 1 to 3 people that are their people, and at least one person who's a strong Black person role model in their life. That makes a huge difference. But we never tend to think about those things, about when a person initially comes into care. It's all about, well, they're part of the system, we're just going to drag them along. Nah, these are kings and queens, and they need to know that they can be whatever they want, because when you instill that in them, they're going to be whatever they want.
Thank you, Cheyanne. Bissy?
I don't have anything else to add. I'm really happy to have been on this panel today.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bissy. And thank you to all 3 of our panelists today. We are listening. We will continue to have these brave spaces. We will commit to doing a self-audit ourselves. So thank you so much for discussing anti-Black racism and how it intersects with children's rights today. And if anybody on this meeting would like to stay, including our panelists, for our AGM, you're welcome to do so for the next 30 minutes.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I will not be able to, but thank you so much. And I look forward to following up with you in the near future.
Yeah, and same thing as Bissy said, I'm very thankful to have been invited to this space to talk about things, but also thankful that this panel was us and not just a Caucasian person speaking about anti-Black racism, as we always see. And so it's very important that this is not a tokenistic panel as well, and you've proven that. Yeah. And I'm really thankful that all of you joined us today, and I'm sure there's much more to talk about in terms of anti-Black racism and child rights, and I look forward to hopefully engaging with this network as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Cheyanne.
Thank you, and thank you so much to everyone who attended today.
Big thank you to all of you. I think Agapi has had to go. Thank you so much, Bissy. Thank you so much, Cheyanne. And thank you, Tara, for moderating the panel as well. We really appreciate it. So I'm just going to give people who are not able to stay for the AGM portion of the CCRC's meeting a chance to log off. Our feelings won't be hurt. We realize that people have things to do, so please do, if you need to log off, go ahead. And if you are able to stay on for the next 28 minutes, we can move forward to the AGM.
Bye, everyone. I have to run off to another meeting.
Bye, thank you. I see there was a few comments about how to stay in touch with the presenters too. They are all found on LinkedIn and Twitter, so it's probably the best way. And I believe Cheyanne has written her email, and maybe Bissy has as well. Okay, so on that note, I think we will begin the business portion of the AGM. For those of you who I haven't met, my name is Kate Butler. I don't think I did a very good intro to myself at the beginning. I was ready to get going with the panel. I've been the co-chair of the coalition for the last year or so, and as many of you know, Kathy Vandergrift is leaving the co-chair position. So as of today, the sad news is that we won't have her on our board, but we will have a chance to talk about that in a minute. So I want to begin this part of the meeting by saying